She was the widow across the street, graceful, quiet, carrying a loneliness I could never name, until the night she looked at me and whispered, "You make the silence bearable." From that moment, everything between us changed. I first noticed her the way you notice something familiar in the background of your life, always there, but never really seen until one evening when the world slowed just enough for your eyes to linger. She lived across the street, in the kind of house that carried its history in the way the wood creaked and the garden leaned against the fence. She was a widow. I knew it not because she ever said it aloud, but because her house seemed to speak for her. The curtains were always drawn halfway, the front porch light left on longer than necessary, as if waiting for someone who would never arrive. She carried herself with that quiet dignity only people who have known deep love, and deep loss, ever seem to have. I would catch glimpses of her sometimes in the evenings. From my window I could see her framed by warm lamplight, moving about her living room with an elegance that never felt hurried. She might be setting a book aside, or folding a shawl neatly over the back of a chair. And every so often, her eyes would drift toward the street, where mine inevitably found hers. There was something in those glances, polite, yes, but never shallow. It wasn't the fleeting nod of strangers who happened to share a neighborhood. It was heavier, as if she were asking without words whether I, too, understood the strange comfort of silence. I remember one particular evening. The air was cool, with autumn just beginning to sharpen the edges of the wind. I had stepped out to collect the mail, and she was on her porch, trimming the last tired blossoms from a pot of marigolds. The street was empty, unusually still. She straightened, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and for the first time, our eyes locked not across the distance of windows but in the soft glow of the street light. She smiled, small, brief, the kind of smile that carries both warmth and hesitation. I felt it linger on me longer than courtesy required. I nodded back, my chest tightening with a strange awareness. It wasn't attraction in the usual sense, not yet. It was recognition. Even from that distance, there was something magnetic about her presence. She seemed to fill the quiet without saying a word. The way her hands moved gently over the flowers, the way her posture held a mix of strength and weariness, made me want to look longer. And though I said nothing, I realized I had been waiting for that small exchange. It was the first thread of something delicate, something I couldn't yet name. That night, when I returned inside, the silence of my own apartment felt different. Heavier somehow. Because across the street was a woman who carried her own silence like a shadow, and for reasons I couldn't explain, I wanted to understand hers. It happened on an evening that carried no expectation, the kind of day that blends into the rest, until one detail shifts and you realize you'll remember it for a long time. I was walking back from the corner store, a small paper bag of groceries tucked under my arm, when I noticed her across the street. She was struggling with her own bags, heavier than she should have been carrying alone. At first I hesitated. Part of me thought she might prefer not to be approached, that perhaps she valued her independence, the quiet way she moved through the world. But then one of the bags slipped slightly from her arm, and instinct carried me forward before doubt could pull me back. "Here, let me help you with that," I said softly as I reached her side. She looked up, startled for just a moment, then let out a breath that was half relief, half resignation. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice warm but quiet, like the low notes of a cello. I took one of the bags from her, the handles cutting into my fingers with their weight. As I steadied it, our hands brushed for the briefest second. Her skin was cool from the evening air, delicate against my palm, and yet the touch left a surprising warmth behind. We walked slowly toward her porch, our steps falling into a kind of unspoken rhythm. The silence between us was comfortable, but not empty. Every sound, the crunch of gravel under our shoes, the distant hum of a street lamp, seemed to frame that silence, making it feel like something we were sharing rather than avoiding. When we reached her door, she set her keys down on the railing and adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. "I hope it wasn't too much trouble," she said, glancing at me with that same faint smile I'd noticed before, the one that never quite reached her eyes but tried earnestly to. "Not at all," I replied. "It's nice to finally talk to you. I see you around sometimes. Her lips curved slightly, as though she found the admission both amusing and touching. Yes, she said softly. I've seen you too. She didn't rush the words. She didn't need to. They came with a kind of weight, as though acknowledging the unspoken noticing that had passed between us for weeks. For a moment neither of us spoke. I could feel the cool wood of her porch beneath my hand as I set the bag down, the faint scent of lavender from her garden drifting on the breeze. The world seemed narrowed to that small space, the gentle curve of her expression, the quiet steadiness of her presence. Thank you again, she said finally, her voice softer now, almost reluctant to end the moment. And as I stepped back toward the street, I realized it wasn't just her groceries I had carried. It was the first few steps into a conversation I hadn't known I'd been waiting for. It was a week later when she invited me inside. Not with grand ceremony, not even with much planning, it just unfolded naturally, like the way dusk quietly replaces daylight. I had been walking home when I noticed her porch light flicker. She was standing just inside the doorway, frowning up at it, a small ladder balanced nearby. I offered to take a look, and she agreed, stepping back to let me in. Her home was exactly what I expected, and yet somehow more. The air carried a faint fragrance of old books and freshly brewed tea, a blend that felt immediately comforting. Everything inside seemed chosen with care: photographs in silver frames, soft quilts folded neatly, a vase of fresh-cut flowers on the table. It was a lived-in space, touched by both memory and intention. When the light bulb was replaced, she insisted on making tea. I almost declined, worried I was intruding, but she tilted her head in that quiet way that made refusal impossible. So I sat, and she poured steaming liquid into 2 porcelain cups, setting one before me on the wooden table. We didn't speak much at first. There was no pressure to. The clock ticked in the corner, steady and unhurried, while the rain outside began its gentle tapping against the windows. She sat across from me, one hand cupped around her tea, the other resting loosely in her lap. What surprised me wasn't the silence, it was how natural it felt. With most people, silence presses in, demanding to be filled. But with her, it stretched comfortably between us, like a shared blanket. I found myself listening not to words but to the small details of her presence, the way her eyes drifted to the window, then back to me, the faint hum she made under her breath when she exhaled, the delicate rise and fall of her shoulders with each measured breath. At one point, she reached for a book that had been left on the table. She didn't open it, just held it loosely, her thumb brushing the edges of the pages. When she noticed my glance, she gave a small, almost embarrassed smile. I read the same passages again and again, she admitted quietly. Not because I forget them, but because they remind me I'm not alone in certain thoughts. Her honesty, given so simply, settled in me like warmth spreading through the chest. I nodded, not trying to fill the space with my own words, because somehow, I sensed that listening, truly listening, was the rarest gift I could offer her. We stayed like that for nearly an hour, sipping tea, watching the rain streak across the glass, exchanging occasional small observations. Yet it was in the silences that something unspoken took root, something steadier than conversation. When I finally stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Her hand brushed against my arm as she reached for the handle, a touch so slight I almost could have missed it, but I didn't. And as I stepped back out into the night, the rain cool against my face, I realized that evening had been less about words and more about recognition. That in her silence, I had found a place where my own felt understood. The rain had returned on the night she let her guard down. Not the gentle kind we had shared before, but a heavier downpour that blurred the streetlights into soft halos and filled the air with the scent of wet earth. She invited me in again, almost casually, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. We sat in her living room this time, not at the kitchen table. The space was warmly lit, a single lamp casting a golden circle around us. She had draped a blanket over the arm of the sofa, and the faint crackle of the fireplace carried a rhythm all its own. I could hear the rain racing against the windows, and for a while, it seemed we might pass the evening just listening to it together. But then she spoke, her voice quiet enough that it seemed meant more for herself than for me. "Some nights," she said, staring into the steam rising from her cup, "it feels as though the house is too large for me. The walls echo in ways they never used to." I didn't move. I let her words sit, heavy and tender, waiting for her to continue. She drew in a slow breath, her eyes fixed on the flames. "After he passed, everyone kept saying time would soften it. That silence would become easier. But time doesn't make silence kinder. It only makes it deeper." Her fingers trembled slightly as she set the cup down. And then, after a long pause, she turned to me, her gaze steady but vulnerable. "You make the silence bearable." The words hung there, fragile as glass, and I felt them settle into me with unexpected weight. For a moment I didn't know what to do with them. It wasn't a declaration, not exactly, it was an unveiling. A piece of her grief, placed carefully in my hands. I reached forward slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. My hand found hers where it rested on the sofa cushion. Her skin was cool, her fingers delicate beneath mine, but the contact seemed to anchor her. She exhaled softly, and I felt her hand turn just enough to return the touch. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice low, careful not to break the moment. "You don't need to say anything," she replied. Her eyes shimmered faintly in the lamplight. "It's enough that you're here." We sat like that, her hand in mine, the rain softening outside as though the storm itself had grown weary. No grand promises were exchanged, no dramatic gestures. Just a widow admitting her loneliness, and a younger man realizing that in her presence, he too felt something rare, needed. When I left that night, I carried her words with me. They echoed not as sorrow, but as a fragile kind of trust, the first real bridge between us. After that night, something shifted between us. Not outwardly, there were no sudden confessions, no dramatic changes in routine, but I felt it in the spaces between our words, in the glances that lingered a little too long. She had let me glimpse her loneliness, and in doing so, she had opened a door I wasn't sure either of us knew how to walk through. The next time I visited, it was a calm evening. The rain had passed, leaving the streets washed clean, and her garden glistened under the porch light. She welcomed me in with her usual grace, but I noticed it immediately, the hesitation in her smile, the way her hands folded together, as if to steady themselves. We sat side by side on the sofa, a book resting unopened on the table before us. I could feel the warmth of her presence, the faint brush of her sleeve against mine when she shifted slightly. Every movement, every breath seemed heightened, charged with meaning. She broke the silence first, her tone light but laced with something deeper. "People would think it odd, wouldn't they? The two of us spending so much time together." I turned toward her, surprised not by the words but by the vulnerability tucked within them. Her gaze didn't quite meet mine, instead, it lingered on her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Does it matter what they think?" I asked quietly. Her lips curved in a faint, wistful smile. "It shouldn't. But sometimes. I wonder if it does." She exhaled slowly, her shoulders rising and falling as though carrying a weight she rarely shared. "I've lived long enough to know how people talk. How quickly kindness can be mistaken for something else." Her words struck me, not as rejection, but as a truth she was struggling with. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that what we shared wasn't just kindness, that it was something more. But the words caught in my throat. Because to admit it would be to step past a line we were both carefully circling. Instead, I reached for the book on the table and opened it, pretending to skim the first page. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing mine, and for a moment, the air between us felt electric. I could smell the faint hint of her perfume, something floral and understated, and I had to steady my breathing. Her hand moved, almost without thought, grazing the back of mine as she reached for the book. The touch was brief, accidental perhaps, but the warmth it left lingered long after. We sat there like that, close enough to feel each other's presence yet separated by all the hesitations either of us dared to name. And though no words were spoken, I understood her conflict as if it were my own. The world outside might have seen something forbidden, something to whisper about. But sitting there beside her, I knew the truth. What bound us was not scandal but solace. It was a storm that brought us closer than either of us had planned. The kind that rolls in without warning, drumming against rooftops and rattling the windows until the whole night seems alive with unrest. I had gone across the street to check on her, carrying nothing but a half-formed excuse that I wanted to be sure she was all right. She opened the door almost before I knocked, as if she had been waiting. The lights flickered behind her, shadows stretching long against the walls. "Come in," she said simply, her voice steady but touched with relief. Inside, the storm seemed louder, the wind tugging at the shutters, the rain hammering against the glass. She had lit a few candles, their glow softening the room, painting her features in warm, golden tones. She motioned for me to sit on the sofa, then joined me with a blanket draped loosely around her shoulders. For a while, we just listened. The storm outside, the soft hiss of the fireplace, the creak of the old house. It was as if the world had conspired to press us closer together. She pulled the blanket tighter, and I noticed a slight shiver in her hands. "Here," I said gently. "Let me." I reached for the edge of the blanket, tugging it more securely around her shoulders. My hand brushed the curve of her arm as I tucked it in, and when I glanced up, her eyes were already on mine. There was no mistaking the quiet vulnerability there, or the trust. She leaned ever so slightly, her shoulder finding its place against me. At first, it was tentative, as if testing whether I would pull away. I didn't. Instead, I shifted closer, letting her weight settle gently against my chest. The moment was quiet, but it carried the kind of weight that made words unnecessary. I could feel the warmth of her cheek through the thin fabric of my shirt, her breath soft and steady against me. My arm moved almost instinctively, wrapping around her in a gesture that was both protective and tender. Time slowed. The storm outside faded into a distant hum, replaced by the sound of her breathing, the rhythm of my heartbeat beneath her ear. She sighed, a sound that was part weariness, part release, and I felt the tension in her body ease as she allowed herself to rest fully against me. I didn't speak. I didn't dare. Because in that silence, something passed between us, something neither of us had named but both of us felt. When she finally lifted her head, her eyes searched mine, filled with something unspoken. Not sorrow, not gratitude, but something far more fragile and precious. Her hand came to rest on my arm, fingers curling lightly as if anchoring herself. And in that moment, I realized the invisible line we had both respected for so long had blurred, not broken recklessly, but softened into something inevitable. We didn't kiss. We didn't need to. The intimacy of her leaning into me, of allowing me to hold her through the storm, was already more profound than any words could carry. When the storm passed, it left the world washed clean. The morning after was quiet, the street glistening with puddles that mirrored the soft glow of sunrise. I stepped outside, and as always, my eyes wandered across to her house. This time, she was already on the porch, a shawl draped around her shoulders, her hands curled around a steaming cup. She smiled when she saw me, an unguarded smile, warm and steady, one that reached her eyes in a way it hadn't before. I crossed the street, the air crisp and cool, the grass still heavy with dew. She didn't say anything when I reached her steps. She simply moved over on the porch swing, leaving space beside her. I sat, the wood creaking softly beneath us, and together we watched the morning unfold. There was no need for grand declarations. What bound us had never relied on them. Instead, it was in the quiet gestures, the way her hand rested on mine without hesitation, the way our shoulders touched lightly as we leaned back against the swing. "I don't think I realize," she said softly, watching a bird flit across the wet street, "how much life can change after loss. You think the hardest part is the grief, but sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's learning how to let joy in again." Her words settled between us, gentle and true. I turned my hand, letting my fingers interlace with hers. She looked at me then, not with the guardedness of before, but with an openness that made my chest tighten. "I'm not asking for promises," she continued, her voice steady but tender. "Just companionship. someone to share the silence with. I squeezed her hand lightly. That's all I've wanted too. We sat like that, hands joined, the world carrying on around us, the distant hum of a car, the soft laughter of children playing down the street, the chirp of crickets still lingering from the night. Yet everything felt different, because the space between us was no longer uncertain. She leaned her head gently against my shoulder, and I felt the strands of her hair brush against my cheek. It was such a simple thing, yet it carried the weight of everything we hadn't said aloud. There was no rush, no fear, just the quiet relief of two people who had found in each other what they hadn't known they were missing. As the sun climbed higher, I realized something. The street between our homes no longer felt like a distance. It was just a small crossing, one I would gladly make again and again. And in that moment, with her hand in mine and her presence steady beside me, I understood fully what she had once confessed. Yes, the silence was still there. But together, we had made it bearable. If this story touched you, don't forget to subscribe for more slow-burn romances like this one. Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on moments of unexpected companionship in your own life. And if you'd like more stories of age gap romance, older woman, younger man connections, or forbidden attraction, make sure to turn on notifications so you never miss the next chapter.